So I'll try to read the chat box here and there. So if you do have any questions, just throw it in the chat box, or basically we'll work it out and we'll figure it out as we go. I've used Zoom and different things for conference calls and different things for work, but this is actually the first workshop that I've tried running with it. So we'll see how that goes. Like I was saying, I'll go through the presentation, I'll introduce myself, and my goal is not to cover everything in this slide, but so that you get concepts that you can now read up on and learn more and be more observant when you look at your hives. So a lot of these things, some people say I make a lot of assumptions. I guess in theory, to theorize, to learn, you do have to make assumptions. You have to put theories together. You have to test those theories. And it's the only way to learn, okay? Because the one common thing with everybody here, so we've got people from the Yukon, Alaska, Alberta, BC, Ontario, there's a few from Quebec, Ohio, Missouri, Montana, a bunch of different places. And the one thing we all have in common is we're keeping bees. So bee biology is the same anywhere you live, okay? I've been keeping bees in the Yukon for about 7 years. I kept bees in northwestern Ontario, so north of Thunder Bay, so in a place called Red Lake, just east of Winnipeg for about 4 years. I've always been self-taught because everywhere I've kept bees, it's been remote, rural, and there's never been any other beekeepers. My background is engineering, but it's in training and education now. I usually teach engineers to be practical and a bit more, help them out with their communication skills so they can bring down the language so everybody can understand what they're talking about. And in a nutshell, I'll go through my story, and then as we go, we'll see where it flows. And I am a beeaholic, and my wife's a bee widow. And it's just the fact that once you fall in love with this hobby, a lot of us actually take it to extremes. So I'll start at the beginning, and you'll see that wintering bees is actually less about insulation, less about the winter itself, but more about preparing the bees, making sure your bees are healthy, they have the right type of food, and they have everything they need to be successful. So I'll just get rid of this little comment. Okay, so beekeeping is local. We all know that. To be successful in the north, we're actually very lucky that if we deal with mites early, mites, we always have them, but their numbers are always really, really low. So when I do my alcohol washes, my mite drops, I'm always below 0%. My second year, before I started using oxalic acid vapor, I did have a mite bomb where I never treated, and then the mites in year 2 went crazy, and then I had crazy mites. But since then, I've learned I deal with them early. When I get my nooks, I treat them after a week or two, a couple of times, and then my mite issues are over. Folks further down south, mites, if you don't deal with your mites and you organically or a way of controlling them, then they will be your bane. The next bit, nutrition, is one thing I underestimated in my first 5 years, I'd say 4 years. and it was especially fall nutrition. Okay, my bees would overwinter. They'd make it to spring, but then they'd be really slow coming out of spring into summer. They wouldn't die, but they wouldn't be ready till July, mid-July. Luckily, that's our honey flow, but it was really, really slow. Okay, so I'll go through what I did to help them get a nicer boost in April, and it actually made them overwinter even better. And now it's common for me to get really nice clusters over 8 frames of bees, even 10, 16 frames of bees. And then lots of healthy bees. So good nutrition and lots of healthy bees go hand in hand. So you need good nutrition in the right amount to get a lot of bees. So to overwinter well, you need a lot of bees. And if you went through the presentation, you'll see that the number of bees to the volume is critical for your bees to overwinter. Okay, so right now I have a 5-frame nook that went through the winter and it's still alive, and it's full of bees and it's doing well. And I'm just hoping that we finally get into warm temperature so I can actually go in and give it some pollen patties and box it into a bigger box. Okay, so its size of the hive versus the number of bees is probably a really critical measure. There's a lot of different sayings online. For example, bees really don't die from the cold. They don't heat the hive. There's all these statements that people make. And in general, those statements are too broad and they're cop-outs. They're not the right answer. Okay, so in a wood hive, so with no insulation, they don't heat the hive is true because it loses so much heat that they can't keep that hive warm. But in a polystyrene hive or an insulated hive, just the waste heat from the cluster is enough to warm up that hive. Okay, so at minus 10, I'll use Celsius. At minus 10 to minus 15, early in the season, my bees weren't yet in cluster. Okay, so it was a really, really loose cluster and they were still covering the 9 frames per box, forward, back. Okay, so you'll see that insulating a hive, it doesn't matter where you are, how you do it, how much you put is what you need to figure out for your area. Let's see. And the other big thing is currently, so for example, right now, it's 4 degrees Celsius, so it's 40, 41 Fahrenheit. This morning it was minus 18. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. And we're going to get that for the next 2 weeks to a month, where we might get a 10 degrees Celsius during the day and then a minus 10 to minus 20 at night. So the other thing that the insulation does is it knocks those peaks out. It flattens it out, and it means that your brood nest can be bigger because the bees have to spend less time heating the brood nest, okay, because it is warmer. Just a disclaimer, yes, this is my approach. So whatever I say, you need to put a filter on to filter for your location, okay? Like I mentioned before, bee biology is bee biology and physics is physics. And those things don't change. What changes is what your ambient temperature is, when your first pollen is, what your nectar flows are, your mite loads, all those types of things are things you have control over. Okay, so I'll keep going. I do like talking, so I'll try to keep the flow moving. And I'll keep glancing at that chat box to make sure there's no statements. Okay. Everybody following along? Sounds good? Okay, good. Just make sure I'm not talking in empty air. So one of the things that I've learned, there we go, is when you give presentations, when you give talks, it's important to have objectives and outcomes. And in my beekeeping approach now, I follow the same standard. I'm aligning everything I do with my local bee cycle from spring to winter. I want to maximize the use of my local forage. If I don't have to feed sugar syrup, I don't want to have to feed sugar syrup. If I don't have to give them pollen supplements, I won't. But I want to know when I have to. Okay, so those are things that I didn't know before that I know now, and I know the cues to figure out when I need to put a pollen patty. So the objective in all my approaches is it's about keeping the bees healthy and keeping them healthy. Supplemental feeding to fill the gaps and understanding the limitations of my environment. So in the boreal forest where I'm at, I can keep maybe 2 to 4 hives max. If there was a forest fire, knock on wood, not that I want one, and then you get all these fireweeds and crazy flowers going, I could probably have up to 10, 20 hives, even 30 hives in a second year fireweed bloom after a forest fire. But currently in just virgin boreal forest, I can keep 2 to 4 hives. The outcome is I want lots of bees. I want them to be vigorous. I want to create my own splits and nooks. I may get queens to bring genetics in. I want some honey and I want some wintering success. I want that to be the norm. I want consistent honey yields. So my first year I had no honey. Second year I had 5 pounds. Then I had 75 pounds per hive. Then I had 35 pounds. Then I had 50 pounds. So it bounces back and forth. So one of my goals is to understand my forage, what triggers the flows, and all those types of things. I want to manage my diseases and my pests. The main 2 up here is mites, if you do nothing about them, and Nosema C. And I've tested it myself with my microscope, and I've had them sent to the lab just to confirm that it's Serrani, and it is that. And how it behaves up here is actually different than what I read in literature down south. Okay, and we'll go into that in a bit. I want to maintain the numbers that I have, and right now I have 8 hives. My goal is to have about 10 hives, a mix of doubles and singles, and I want 4 to 5 nooks overwintering every winter, so that if I lose a couple of hives, I can just make them up with those nooks. And that's where it sustains itself. Sometimes I say your mindset needs to be about making money. So it's not really about making money, but understanding that it's not a free hobby. And the more that your hobby sustains itself, the more you can enjoy it and less hit pocketbook. So remember, I'm in Mount Lorne. I just noticed the question around top entrances and mite controls. We'll get into all that type of stuff. So in my location in Mount Lorne, it's 2 to 4 hives. If you're close to Whitehorse and more urban areas, it's probably higher because there's more sweet clover and clovers along the highway, and there's gardens, there's people with fruity shrubs and fruity trees. It's warmer than where I'm at. Our evening temperature here in the summer is about 5 degrees less than Whitehorse. In the winter, it's about 10 degrees less. So, and that's 30 kilometers away. Okay, I have whatchamacallit, a weather station. So I've been able to understand my environment. Keep the questions coming, that's good. I'll skip over some of the slides because I don't want to bore you with too much slide reading. And then we'll keep half an hour at the end so we can do a Q&A. Let's see, I'll go into presentation mode. Everybody see the presentation? At least one of you say yes. Okay, good. Let's see. I'll just put my pointer so I can. There we go. So this one here is just tips of things that I did to ensure that I'm always improving and getting better. Uh, so I've gone through tons of YouTubes. I've read a bunch of books, the internet, Facebook. You have to be careful because everybody's an expert, and there's dangers there. I'm claiming it right now. I'm not an expert, but I like asking questions, and my favorite question is why. So it's why something happened, and if I get a piece of advice, I'll say, why do you think I should do it? If the person can't answer a why about doing something, then don't do it. There was a comment around top entrances, and we'll cover that in a bit. Let's see, find yourself a mentor. I guess it's difficult in the Yukon. There's a few of us, but most of us have kept bees for less than 10 years. Start with at least 2 to 4 hives. This one here, aim to make money. It's more the mindset than actually make money. The whole bee biology, bee nutrition is really important. Learn about sustainable beekeeping, and that's where you start. So folks going into their second season, if you don't get your first split, that's okay. But into your third season, you need to get into splits and making your own nooks. And if you don't want that many bees, then sell it off or give it to a friend. And that's where you can actually sustain yourself and make up for your losses. Let's see. Don't ignore Varroa. Nosema, I'm learning that I can test. I can see that's Nosema all of the time, but I can't really do anything about it. I could put Fumagillin B in my hive in the fall, and I may try that on 1 or 2 hives. But again, it's a chemical. If my bees make it over the winter, they're all alive now. And if the one that has severe Nosema makes it through the spring, then I won't treat, because it means that I can make a winter even with signs of Nosema and the bees will still make it. Bee havers versus beekeepers. A bee haver is people get bees, they put them in the yard, and then they say nature will take on from there, and then they actually do nothing, and they don't read up, they don't feed the bees, they expect the bees to take care of themselves. Please don't be one of those, because that's where, especially further down south, Varroa becomes an issue, and then you can get into the foul broods or the crud or the snot brood that we seem to be getting. I've got a lot of cranberries in my area, the wild cranberries, and in really hot summers, I may get something that looks like EFB on 1 or 2 hives, but usually with feeding and a pollen patty, it goes away. So it's just some weird disease that they don't really know where it's coming from yet. So if you have a dog, it's easy. If you don't have a dog, go for a walk in your neighborhood or in your area and have a look at the flowers when they bloom, and when they bloom, what type of flower. Is it a shrub? Is it a tree? Do you see your bees on them? How long does it bloom? And you're going to be saying with this slide is like, what's this got to do with winter? It's completely have to do with winter, because pollen and pollen deficiency, what in the Yukon, probably Alaska, interior, I guess in Adlin, that's what's going to hurt your bees with their wintering success, is not enough pollen in late August and into the fall. So for folks not from the Yukon, our fall is pretty much, it starts in August. So from mid-August, we start getting frosts. Most of us are in semi-altitude. So I'm at 780 meters. So that's, what's that? That's 2,000 feet, 2,500 feet. I'm about 100 meters, 150 meter elevation from the tree line. So the tree line here starts at, or the tundra, alpine tundra starts at probably around 900 meters to 1,000 meters. So you can see that our spring, not our spring, our fall comes fairly quick. And then here it says ethical beekeeping. So don't forget those local pollinators and the native ones, and understand your limitations. So in the boreal forest, I try to push people to say, don't go bonkers with too many hives, because then you may start affecting the bumblebees, the mason bees, and all those other ones, because honeybees are pretty competitive. But having 4 or 5 hives in our area won't have much of an impact. Okay, so the bottom statement in the yellow there is learn to a set of filtering questions when you get advice from people not from your area. Okay, so some of these Facebook groups so Facebook groups have like 50, 60,000 members from all over the world, and there's so many experts on them, or so they say. So it's really important that whatever they say, you always filter their statements. Okay, so this is complicated, and what I'll do is I'll just skip over this, and then we'll go into the different concepts. You'll see that we'll start with health and nutrition and food and insulation. And you'll notice insulation is relevant, or it's dependent on where you're from. Okay, so I'll show you a couple of charts like degree days, growing degree days and stuff like that you can use to determine your winter. So you turn that, you flip that upside down and it becomes heating degree days, and there's websites that can give you that. I've taken it a step further where I take it to degree hours, but it lets me filter a winter in, say, Montana versus the winter here. Okay, and basically it helps me understand how much heating is required with how much insulation to keep those bees cozy. But like I mentioned before, health is really important. The blue boxes up there are things that beekeepers can do or ensure or monitor that for their bees to become successful. On the food front, you'll see a lot of literature that says in, say, Ohio, you need 60 pounds of honey this is just an example, to overwinter successfully. Okay? There's so much into that statement because my hive up here last winter used less than 60 pounds because I have insulation. Okay? But one thing I do recommend to everybody is don't be shy when you're getting your hives ready for winter. Is even if I lived, say, down in Montana, I would aim for at least 40 to 60 pounds per deep, regardless of the location. I'll go into more detail, but it's something called thermal mass, but also a honey with the cluster adds some R factor, some insulation factor. So the more honey you have, I guess the cozier those bees will be. And the other thing is the easier your spring will be because you'll never have to worry about your bees starving. Okay, so you can see how these levers, the first two, I want them maxed out. I want super healthy bees with lots of bees, and I want lots of food in my hives, regardless of where I live. The insulation is really depending on where you're at. If you're a commercial beekeeper, this one here becomes economics. Okay, so what's your accepted risk and how much feeding do you need to put in there to get those hives to weight? Okay, it becomes more of an economic question than for us hobbyists or serious hobbyists with, say, 2 hives to 20 hives, this is less of an issue. Okay, so for example, I use about a 10 kg bag, so a 22, 25 pound bag of sugar per hive per season. Okay, so that's 22 pounds, and most of it is actually natural honey. If I get a honeydew flow, so some honeydew, I've learned my lesson now, is I pull that and then I'll have to feed more. Okay, so you'll see that I jump around a lot and I apologize in advance. And I'll cover a lot of this other stuff as we go through. A typical cluster will have waste heat, so just heat coming off the cluster that they can't keep in, of say 5 to 20 watts. Okay, so a light bulb. In a well-insulated hive, at minus 40, at the beginning of the minus 40, it was still 5 degrees in the hive at the coldest spot in the hive. And I'll show you where the coldest spots in the hive are, because that'll give you some strategies against condensation. And now let's go. So I guess the biggest killer that is under your control too is the size of the cluster. So I want to show you that you have the option of downsizing that hive. So most people say merge 2 weak hives. Okay, if it's weak because of health issues, then I probably agree with it. If it's a sick hive, I wouldn't even merge it. I wouldn't even bother contaminating a healthy hive with it. But if it's a weak hive because of you did a late summer split and the bees didn't really ramp up to strength, consider going to a single brood to a nook box. Okay, so that's why I strategized this year is I have 5 doubles, I have 2 singles, and I wanted to see if I could overwinter a nook, a 5-frame nook. And they all survived. So this tells me that instead of sacrificing a queen, so a queen up here, if I bring her up from Vancouver, is $75 to $80. So it gives me a way now to keep my old queens, produce resources, and overwinter them as emergency queens for the spring if I have to. Okay, so small clusters in large volumes equals death for most beehives. Okay, bee rules. And you'll see it's a lot of this is repetitive. So they need a dry home, and dry, you'll see that what condensation really is. Okay, so I live in a cabin and we heat our cabin with wood. So I have a direct understanding of how much wood I need to keep my cabin warm throughout the winter. So I have a 6-cord woodshed and I'm down to 1 cord. Okay, typical winters here is I need 4 cords to 3.5 cords of wood to keep my cabin warm over winter. This winter, I've burnt an extra 1.5 cords than typical winters. Okay, so the analogy there is I could think the same. My bees needed X amount more of heat to keep them going through the winter. Okay, so instead of consuming 60 pounds of honey over this winter, they've probably consumed 75 to 80 pounds. So that's the engineering in me coming out. So they need flowers and flowering shrubs. And don't expect to have success up here if you refuse to feed syrup and patties. A lot of places in Canada, we get dearths or a really short spring or a short fall where we don't get a fall flow. So if you think your bees will survive, and there's always people that do get them through the winter, don't get me wrong. But in general, if you refuse to, when they need these 2 things, they're gonna die. And you'll see I'm fairly blunt, and it's not to insult anybody, is the sooner you understand that the reason your bees didn't overwinter, be it starvation, be it they were wet, be it that the cluster was too small, the sooner you take ownership of that and you say, oh, shoot, I may swear here and there, I apologize. It's something you didn't do as a beekeeper. So my goal here is to give you some tools for your toolbox and observations that you can learn from your mistakes and prevent you from losing bees in the future. So manage your parasites, and I'll just go back 1 or 2. But parasites, Varroa, basically is the killer. It affects 9 fat body functions of the bees. One of those is thermoregulation. And if all your winter bees are compromised because they were being sucked on by the Varroa, they won't make the winter. Even in warmer climates down south, they won't make the winter. And if towards the end, I'll go to the BIP website, so where they do the winter survey in the US, and you'll see the average is 40% in the US of winter losses. In some states, it's up in the 60, 70% loss. When I see that, like I shake my head. It's crazy. And I'd say the majority of that is Varroa, even though people say starvation. And the other one you'll see is, I think this is underappreciated. And you'll notice that there's probably too much active ventilation, which requires too much heat to keep that cluster warm. And we'll go on there. The one thing on Nosema is it's energy robbing. Okay, it sits in their stomach, usually their second stomach, and it's competing for the nutrition and the food that the bees consume. Okay, so because I've had 3 winters where I've had one hive with severe Nosema, I've noticed the difference in consumption. Okay, and I've noticed the difference in mortality, and I have pictures where you see piles of dead bees in front of the hive. Okay, a lot of the literature doesn't really mention about increased mortality. It does mention about energy robbing and consumption. I've seen it, and it's a fact. So if you do have Nosema, those hives will consume more. If you have a lot of active ventilation, you'll see that they need to rob more, eat more just to stay warm. Because say if half of what they consume is feeding Nosema, so they need to feed that much more just to produce the same amount of heat. So when they vibrate and they produce heat, they age a lot quicker. So then they die. And some of my Nosema counts are just crazy, where the slide is just packed, jam-packed with Nosema spores. Okay, so I'll keep going. So this is my approach. Timing will vary depending where you are. And I'll go into feeding in a bit, but I do syrup in the fall until they can't take it anymore. As we go along, you'll see that I've actually stopped doing candy during the winter because I'm aiming for, like if I have 100 pounds, if I can't even lift that hive, then I know they have plenty to last till spring. And then like this winter's been really cold because I heat the house and I know I've used an extra 2 cords. Then I know that some of them might be low. So I did put candy, just hard sugar, where I take sugar, I add some vinegar in there. I throw some essential oils. I'll put some of that Nosevit. It's just a tree extract that I use for Nosema that may or may not do anything. So far, it hasn't done anything, but it's just emergency feed. And then I've checked it, and they haven't even touched it yet. So it's there just in case. And probably tomorrow, I'll put my first pollen patties on. Let's see. So this chart just goes through my typical season. And you'll notice here that in the spring, I think it was Angela from Montana, I'm not sure if she's on, but she was mentioning small clusters, and the clusters get smaller and smaller. So a lot of times, one of the problems there is the cluster is too small for the volume. So probably in the next 2 weeks, when I go through my hives, one thing I'll measure is how big's the cluster, and is it big enough to maintain its volume. So if it's in a double and there's less than 6 frames a piece, I'll bring her down to a single box, or I might even bring it down to a 6 frame polynook, and I'll crunch it down just to to give those bees a boost, because the temperature will increase. Okay, so like for example, a nook, it won't be producing 20 watts of waste heat. It might be producing 4 watts of waste heat. But that 4 watts is enough to keep that 5-frame nook warm. So it means that the bees have to spend less energy keeping that brood nest warm. Okay, because this is the critical time right now to get those bees going. So the reason I'm going to put pollen patties is to make sure that they can start laying. So by the time I do my first inspection, I'll be able to see if the queens have started laying or not. So it can give me a head start on those queens. Usually late April, I'll swap a couple of the old frames out. The black ones, the ones that I got with my nooks, the ones that the vendors are trying to get rid of, the ones that probably carry disease. I get rid of 1 or 2 of those per brood box every season. And also in April, I'll do my first queen check. If I can see brood, eggs, and things like that, then I'm happy. But if I don't see it, I'm not worried about it. Okay, because depending on how big the cluster was, how healthy the bees were, how much pollen or vitologen, I can't pronounce that word, the fat body content that they use to raise the first cycle of brood. Sometimes I won't see eggs until late April, early May. But what I do is I do 3 specific checks over the April to end of May to see how quickly that queen is laying. If the queen is not, if I'm not satisfied by the end of May, then I'll order a queen and get a queen shipped up and requeen. If the queen is still healthy, she's laying but not laying enough, I'll probably take that queen and I'll stick her in a 5-frame nook box. And then usually they do much better because the volume is much smaller. And then I just use her to build brood frames and honey frames and resource frames to help with my other hives. So my pollen feeding is usually, last year, my first one was mid-March because we had like 12 degrees mid-March. The snow melted, everything was honky-dory. But then we got 3-4 weeks of cold last year. But because I use polystyrene hives, it doesn't matter. They're crunched together, so they're sharing a common wall. They did well. They didn't poop all over the hive, and I had really nice brood nests. We're finally starting to get, I guess, above 0 days from yesterday. So I'm going to go put a pollen patty on probably tomorrow, and I use half pollen patties, and I want them to be able to cleanse if they have to. So if it's on and off, even low minuses, but sunny, 1 or 2 degrees here and there, I know the bees can cleanse if they have to. And then we'll talk about the fall pollen feeding and why I do it and what I've discovered. I tend to use 1-to-1. You could use 2-to-1 even in the spring. It doesn't really matter. And this depends on do they need it or not. So if I have a really strong hive and I'm going for my June flow, so the native Yukon flowers, then I'm going to feed till June or early June, and then I'll let them go and collect some really nice local honey. If I'm going for the July flow, I'll do spot feeding here and there throughout this period, just to make sure that they're topped off to maximize the population. I do mite checks now, either via washes or sticky boards. And like I said, if I treat year 1, those hives don't have mite issues. I'll typically enlarge my entrance not before June, because for me, it's about heat conservation. It's about keeping that brood nest as warm as possible so that they can raise as much brood as I want or as they need. One, to go into swarming season, because I actually love swarms now. and I preempt swarms, and I use really nice big swarm cells to make my splits and to raise my own queens. No, it works really well. And then the other one is around June is when I do my splits and basically drop a double to a single to get it ready for the June flow. Honey supers I add as required. I do lots of hive monitoring, so temperatures and humidities in my hive, and I have some weight scales on one hive in each of my yards. So it pretty much tells me when the nectar flow is coming, but also lets me know where the gaps are. And then I can look into the environment and see, oh, shoot, okay, there's the cue for this dearth. You'll notice that it's pretty late, actually. I tend to remove my honey supers early August, mid-August, so that I can get them going ready for winter. If you have honeydew, the honeydew flow is actually right in August here. So one thing I'm going to do is I'll pull my fireweed supers off early August. I'll feed them for a week just to boost them up. And then I'll put a honey super back on just to see if I can get some honeydew. So honey tastes great, but it's terrible for wintering. And I guess up here we get a mix of spruce and pine honeydew. And it makes really, really nice, dark, thick honey. I don't do my packing till late October into November. And I don't really need to pack because it's already in a polystyrene hive. And usually I'll move the hives into position. So I'll sandwich one or two or three hives together. I tend to put my weaker hive in the middle if I go 3 hives. And I'll explain why I do that and why it's important to do stuff like that. I'll address the active ventilation and passive and what it is and what it means in a bit. And then for Varroa, I use oxalic acid vapor. And I've got one of those little vaporizers, and I'll probably do one in May. I'll take my strongest hive. I might do a wash, and then I'll do a check with the OAV. And then it gives me an idea of how effective the wash was, because most of the times each of these washes always give me 0 mites, and I follow Randy Oliver's way of just 1 frame off the brood nest. And basically I found that sticky boards and just doing an OAV on 1 or 2 hives in my yards is the best way for me to get an idea of my mite counts. Main flows, basically the June flow is lingonberry, so the low bush cranberries. It's beard tongue, so it's a lot of native prairie type flowers. And it's all flowers that probably in Alberta in the native prairies you'll have, so beard tongues and stuff like that. But a lot of them are just native up here. There's a Jacob's ladder and all the things that ornamentals or people grow in ornamental gardens, but here they just grow native in the meadows. And then we get the sweet clover / fireweed flow in July, mid to late July. And then inspections. You can see that I do an inspection every 10 days to 14 days, especially around swarming time. And that's just to make sure I don't want my bees to swarm, but I want to use the swarms to do splits. And once I'm past that point, then I'm confident that they won't swarm. Then I can just extend the period in between inspections. Nutrition, there's lots of info out there. So I won't go into too much detail, but nectar, we all know what it is. One key concept here is you want capped honey in your supers for winter. So if you have uncapped stuff, especially up here, you'll get moisture issues over winter. And too much moisture leads to dysentery. Too much dysentery may lead to Nosema. Okay, so dysentery is a vector for propagating Nosema spore across the bees. Okay, because the bees, they like cleaning up, and up in the Yukon, Alaska, we get a cleansing flight, probably in October maybe, and then the next one is until March if we're lucky, and April, where we get a really good cleanse, where you go out in the bee yard with your suit and your bee suit gets covered with bee feces. But so we don't get many cleansing flights, so it's really important that our honey be really well, I guess, it needs to be dry and cured. Honeydew, if you've never seen it, it's a really dark, viscous honey, and it doesn't crystallize. Mine took about 3 years to crystallize. It's still not fully crystallized, and it's got a woody flavor to it. It's a type of honey, if you've never tasted it, and it looks like buckwheat honey, but thicker, and it tastes different. And your hive will survive if you use insulation, and I'll go into top entrances or active ventilation in a bit, but it's risky. Pollen is critical, and I'll go through a couple of, I've done some pollen collecting in the last little while, and for me, pollen is the link between EFB, certain diseases, population growth, and just stressors. So when there's no pollen flowing in, my bees don't do good. So that's where I need to supplement. And then water. Water is really important. And my soil thickness here is about an inch, half an inch. So there's no soil, it's all mineral soil. So the plants dry up really, really quick. And luckily there's a swamp about 100 yards, 100 meters from the apiary. So the bees can go there, but I usually keep a couple waterers here and there. Just a pan with an inverted jug with some rocks. I keep chickens here, so I've got a lot of chicken waterers that are chicken feeders that I can use to water the bees. So this chart here, hard to read. I'll link up the actual Excel file, but these are all the flowers in my area and the timing of when they're flowering. And I just had a notepad where I'd walk, I'd see a certain flower's flower, I'd write down the name of the flower and then the date. And then when I stop seeing that flower, then I take it off. And knowing, because I have weight scales on my hives, I could tell, so these red lines is where I get consistent weight gains without feeding on my hives. Let's see, the pollen colors. So this is a summer, so a June pollen. This here is an August pollen. You can see there's fireweed with the yellow is probably some decumbent goldenrod. So the goldenrod up here is actually only 6 inches tall. So it's not the big Canadian goldenrod that grows like a meter and a half tall. It's a really tiny goldenrod. These red dots in this chart here, in this picture, those are actually rust spores. I'll cover rust spores in a slide or two. And sometimes I only have rust spores coming in. I thought it was hawkweed pollen coming in. There's some brighter orange stuff that's hawkweed, but this red stuff is actually rust spores. And it's not good. I'll talk about, I use polystyrene hives, so I don't have to worry about insulation all year long. So it's got an R7 or 6.4 throughout the season. The only thing I do is I separate the hives, okay? And I take my bubble foil cover off, and I'll go through insulation in a bit. So hive management. So this is just nectar flows. This is FYI. This is info you need for your own local area, okay? You don't need a scale, but you'll notice the first time you get a nectar flow, you'll see, oh, wow, because you get a lot of that white wax, fresh wax, everything fills up. There's really nice smells. The bees come in the landing board all heavy. You can see they're laden with some weight. They almost look like they have pollen, but even heavier, and they have trouble hitting the landing board. So because we want a lot of bees, brood is key, and brood health and brood rearing is what you need to be doing. So here I say 20 to 50 pounds per season. I've heard it's anywhere from 40 to 100 pounds per season per hive, okay, of pollen. This is sort of my population curve for bees up here. The blue is the pollen, and then the orange is the population. Okay, so typically I can get my bees to peak usually mid-June to mid-July. But you can see where I've learned that I have to feed pollen patties in pretty much in April, and again early to late to mid-August I start putting pollen patties, and I'll show you the next slide why. Sometimes I have to do it in July if we get a really warm summer where it's dry and there's no nectar coming in, even though there's full of flowers, but nothing's coming in. There's no pollen coming in. I'll put some pollen patties on to avoid this. So this was the same event. Is I had some bees that looked like they had deformed wings. So these were larvae that they popped out. I had some of these twisty larvae. I had some melted larvae. So this is where it looks like EFB. It looks like that's not brood, or the crud, like they call it in southern US. I did the match test to make sure it wasn't AFB, so it wasn't. But this was only one hive, but all I had to do was throw on some sugar syrup and a pollen patty, and within a week this was gone and it was back to normal. So even, and this hive did not have mites, but you can see that under stress, the virus loads come out. Even though they may not have mites, they still have virus loads. And it usually takes a season or two for those bees to work through those viruses. I like looking at my hives. If you haven't read this book or looked at this book, I think this link is still good. But if you Google it, it's available as a PDF online for free. Or you can buy they've reprinted it, and Amazon sells it if you're looking for it. A lot of this will tell you how your bees are doing. So I won't go through the whole detail, but just know that watching your hives, seeing if there's pollen coming in, looking at your inserts if you're using a screen bottom board, looking at your inserts to see, is the nest growing? Is there a lot of dark cappings? So I'll cover that in a bit. Moisture on the landing board is an indicator of a nectar flow, or that they're drying something in the hive. So usually it's nectar flow. Most of my inspections are 5-minute inspections. Is I know why I'm going. If I don't have a goal, I'll just look at the screen bottom board. I'll look at the entrance, just look at the bees. I won't open the hive up. So I tend to pull 2 to 4 frames. I'm looking for eggs, and I'm looking for the for brood and like cat brood and just the basic pattern. Is there 1 or 2 frames of honey, at least that for each hive? Are they packing some pollen in? That interface between the brood nest or the brood pattern, then you get some pollen sometimes and then some nectar on the outside. So that there I look at, is it expanding, is it shrinking? Number of frames of bees, is it expanding? I'm not good at keeping notes, so I've been just scratching things or posting it on Facebook. And that's my notes is, okay, I've inspected this hive. How big, how many frames of bees? Let's see. So on the frames, so frame count of bees in March to add pollen patties, if they have honey, if it's a double box and the nest is pretty small, I'm gonna throw pollen patties on, like right now it's gonna be 5 degrees. So if after this talk, if it's still warm, I'll be going to put a pollen patty on those hives. And if the, say the brood, or sorry, the cluster is so small that it hardly covers anything, first opportunity I'll shrink it down, but I'll still throw a pollen patty on there so that they have access, and then the bees can actually use that to help rear the new brood versus their body fat, if that makes sense. Okay, let's see. And then during the first, I've got 2 or 3 full inspections that might take me 15 minutes to a half an hour, and that's where I do a cleanup. I clean the bottom board. I usually have a couple extra ones where I'll, like the one with Nosema right now, I'll probably give it a fresh bottom board, maybe a fresh super, and I'll just swap the frames over so that they're starting with fresh equipment. So for those who use solid bottom boards, you won't really be able to see these things, but I love my screen bottom boards because they let me look in the hive without opening up the hive. So after my treatments, they let me see how effective the treatment was. I can put some Crisco grease on here and the mites will stick on it, so then I can do a count. Usually you do that, you leave it on for 3 days, and then you do a count based on 3 days of drops. So divided by 3, and then it gives you a 24-hour drop. But you can see the lines, they match up with the frames, and you can see some dark cappings, sometimes you see some white wax. So if I see a lot of white wax along the edges here, where I put my fresh frames, so I know that they're drawing those frames out. If I get a lot of dark cappings in the middle, so I know that my brood nest is hatching out. So then I can go and have a look, and I clean it off after every inspection, so it gives me a snapshot between the inspections. Okay, so assessing the queen. Again, I haven't even talked about winter yet, but it's about nutrition and it's about a lot of bees. So my first warm day, I'll go in. Usually if I have more than 6 frames of bees, it used to be a good start, but the last year I had hives with 12 frames of bees, and another one with my weakest had 10 frames, and my strongest had 18 frames, so it's basically full. Right now I have 2 hives that started brood rearing in February, and the reason I know that is I have temperature sensors in them, and I know that they're at their 35 degrees C, so 95 Fahrenheit, and you can sort of see the curve, and I know that they've started building a brood nest around where my temperature sensor is, which is a good indicator for me. And I'm not worried about it because they're insulated hives, so I don't have to worry about the heating load. In a wooden hive, not insulated or poorly insulated, I'd be worried because now that nest or those bees need to heat that brood nest to keep it at temperature. Okay, so hopefully that starts making sense. So it's key. So a week or 2 or 3 weeks later, I'll go again in that same hive and I'll count the frame of bees. So if I have more bees than the previous time, I'm happy. If I have less, then I'm worried, but I'm not panicked the second inspection. Okay, if it's doubled in size, super happy. and then I'll do a 1 or 2 frame check to see how the nest looks like. So late May is where I'll do the third assessment, and it's where if they haven't really grown, then basically that queen's done. I'll put her in a nook box if she is laying. But basically here, the second inspection, if I don't see eggs, and I've put pollen patties, I may do an early inspection to say, okay, maybe there's no queen. Okay, so the key is there a queen? So queen, no queen, that decision can be made here. If there is a brood nest, then you know there is a queen. And then basically the third inspection is where I assess the queen. It says she's good, she's bad. And again, it's key to shrink that nest if there's too few bees in too big of a volume. I can't reiterate that more. And sometimes you have a super strong hive and you don't want them to split too early because there's no drones. So I may take a frame or 2 of brood to boost weaker hives. So I won't go through this. It's just a way of boosting hives or moving nurse bees over. If you've never done it, read it. There's a bunch of Google. We can talk about this later. Okay, winter risk. So I haven't confirmed it yet, but I have booming hives in July. The population is massive. It's going crazy. And then all of a sudden the brood nest is gone. And there's still a queen. So the brood nest is fist size, hardly anything happening. And this shift is within a week to 2 weeks. So one thing that I am guessing is the pollen quality has changed, or there's less pollen coming in, and then it's the color of pollen. Okay, so it may be due to pollen. It may be due to those rust spores that I'll talk about in a bit, and it may be due to Nosema, so a late season Nosema. Again, cluster size going into winter. If it's too small, that hive won't make it. So consider shrinking it down. And then wet honey stores is a disaster for dysentery and Nosema. So rust spores. So you might ask, how the hell do I know? Is I and I saw my bees on my fireweed that was extinct. So pretty much we had a frost, and then my fireweed gets covered with this rust, and the bees were all over it. And then they were flying back to the hive. And then I noticed these orange pellets, not this orange pellet, but this orange was predominant pack. This was what was getting packed into the frames. So then I like to know why things happen. So then I took some samples off of these leaves, and then I found some of these pebbles in my screen bottom board insert, and then I checked it in the microscope, and lo and behold, they're rust spores. So after reading up on stuff that Randy Oliver shared, this kills his brood rearing, and the hives or the populations tend to nosedive when this happens. So his solution is to feed pollen patties. So I'm using his approach. This is pollen that I collected mid-August that I didn't have enough time to check in the summer, so I checked a couple of months ago, and then I looked at these red things, trying to figure out what they were, and then I found these things. And I guess I'd seen this in my honeydew honey too, but these bottom are rust spores, and this is a winter rust spore that they call it. I can't say the word because it's a big Latin name, but if you're curious, if you've got a lot of the wild roses in your area and you get that orange, really bright fluorescent orange rust on there. So if pollen goes in deficiency because it's too hot and dry and the plants are all stressed out, your bees will start collecting this orange stuff. You can see that luckily it was a small percentage here. They were still getting some real pollen, but they were still feeding this stuff to the bees. So we're getting closer to winter now. Stress. Stress is a killer for bees. So if your bees aren't getting their nutrition, moisture in winter, mite populations, if you're going to the hives too much. So there's all these things about checkerboarding and pyramiding and swapping your boxes bottom to top. Uh, and you could be in your hive almost every day. And as a beekeeper, we'd love that, but your bees wouldn't. So hence the reason I try to limit my inspections to 10 days. If it's close to swarming and it's like a booming hive, I might shorten that to 7 days, 5 days to 7 days, because I'm looking for those swarm cells just as they're getting capped. So I'm playing it close, but once that swarm cell is capped, then that goes into a nuc box with a bunch of frames to make a split. And then poor queen performance. So you can see I've covered these so far in how I do my inspections, how I cover my nutrition, and how I look at my diseases and mites. Okay, so we've seen this, and this was that spotty frame that we saw before. And take pictures, take pictures, take pictures, because pictures can help other people help you understand what's going on. Especially up here, we don't have there's no laws, there's no regulation. We don't have a territorial inspector. We are it, we have to help each other, and that's how it works. So not too much on Varroa, because everything talks about Varroa. Just know your Varroa count and do something about it. Varroa biology. So Samuel, that doctor not too long ago, he did a bunch of talks and he did some research and he discovered that the mites actually feed on the fat body and not on the hemolymph of the bee, so the blood. And you can see these are all the things that the fat body regulates. So growth, energy. So luckily in the Yukon, we don't have to deal with pesticides much unless your neighbors spray stuff. So water control, immune function, thermal regulation, metabolic rate, so protein and fat synthesis. So the last two is actually around your early brood rearing. So you can see that if your bees are mite compromised, then brood rearing gets all out of whack. And you can see how your thermal regulation of your hive will get affected. And chances are they may become more prone to Nosema symptoms. They lose control of water. So it means that if when they're consuming their honey and how they manage the water produced for exchanging it, there's some really good articles from Mr. Oliver that he published in the last couple of issues of American Bee Journal. They're all on his website now. Really good reading. But you can see how mites, just looking at that, it messes your bees up. And all I'll say is good luck. So different ways of monitoring. We won't cover that, but just know there's several ways. And success factors. I'll repeat it again. The only way to get a lot of healthy bees is if you start in spring, because you need a lot of bees to raise your nectar flow bees, and you need a lot of bees to produce your winter bees. So you can see how if you wait to treat for mites in August or in September, your bees are compromised already. So you got sick bees taking care or raising winter bees. And you can see how it's a chain. You have to start now. So do you know when your last pollen is versus when winter starts? What's the time period there? So do you know your floral sources? So for example, we talk about dandelions a lot. So dandelions actually, they're low in protein. Okay, it's a good supplemental nectar and pollen, but if it's your primary pollen, your bees will probably go pollen deficient. Okay, so just because you have pollen coming in does not mean that they're getting all the nutrition they need. Unfortunately, there's not much research and scientists doing research on pollen quality. There's a few papers out there, and there's a couple of interesting tables that show the different pollen levels or different essential amino acids for the different pollens. But they typically say that it needs to be at over 20% protein/lipid levels for them to be worthwhile pollens to help the bees out. So adequate winter stores, I aim for 60 pounds. Sometimes I get less. I get between 40 to 60 pounds per box. I know about honeydew now. I didn't know 4 years ago, I didn't know what it was, and I lost all my hives, and I had lots of dysentery and poop everywhere in the hive and thousands of dead bees outside my hive. I'll go through that in a bit. Some honeys will crystallize. So I know down south, was it the goldenrod honey crystallizes fairly quick, or the canola honey? So if you're wintering on some of those honeys, you have to be careful. Let's see, dry home. We'll cover that in more detail, but leaky homes, where do you get condensation in your house? It's where you get cold air infiltrating through those little gaps, and that's where you get your wet spots in your house, in your ceiling, in your roof, and stuff like that. So I've started taping all my seams on all my boxes. And if you live in warmer climes, bare minimum, you need to insulate your top. And I know sometimes some of you guys use 1 inch. You lose, typically, this is the engineer in me. So side walls versus top, you lose 15 to 25% more heat off the top of a structure. Okay, so heat rises, so you tend to lose a lot more heat from the top. So it's critical that you go heavy on top insulation. You don't need to go crazy like me, do R40 on top. You R10, R5, like 1 inch to 2 inch, depending on where you are. And then number 2 is sidewalls. And we'll talk about strategic condensation. Okay, so for folks up in Alaska and in the Yukon, we will get those -40s, and even in Alberta in certain places, and you can either plan for it or you cannot. Okay, when I say plan for it is at -40, the condensation will happen. There's nothing you can do about it because it's so damn cold. Okay, but you can decide where that condensation will happen, and I'll show you a couple tricks to do that. So that's where will moisture condense in your setup. So how do you manage it? And I'm actually moving away from quilts now. So I had a couple of hives this winter with quilts, and the ones that had super heavy top insulation actually have less moisture in them. Okay. We'll talk about top vents versus no top vents, and then the screen bottom board. And the screen bottom board, they're open in mine, but once you see pictures, there's no way the wind draft or mice can get underneath. They're blocked off. So there's no way the wind or a cold draft can flow freely up. And because I don't use a top vent, I don't get any flow through ventilation. Okay. So when I lost all my beehives to honeydew, the other thing there is I had a top vent and I had an open screen bottom board. Okay, so the stores, they were eating like crazy because they were losing a lot of heat. So they needed to poop a lot because all the heat was flowing out the top because I had a big hole in the bottom. Okay, so we'll cover that concept in a bit. Mice protection, in most places you need to do something, and then wind protection. So most of my yards, I think there's a couple pictures, you'll see that I have a pallet fence with some black geotex all around because my mornings are cold and I want that yard to warm up fairly quick. and in the summer, but also it helps with wind control. So again, repeating myself, strong populous colony, vigorous queen. I'll try to keep all my main hives with queens less than 2 years, so maximum 2 winters. I may keep my 3-year queens in a nook box in smaller outfits. So healthy brood, so you need to start treating for your mites now. So now if it's spring for you, and now as soon as possible if it's still snowy like it is here. Make sure you have enough honey. Bee bread stores, there's not much you can do there, especially where we live. So they won't pack the pollen patties into the frames. So one reason I'll start pollen patties earlier is that the rearing bees can use the pollen patties to feed those winter bees. But then the forager bees bringing in the fireweed pollen, which is the last pollen here, can actually get packed into the frames for spring. Okay, so if I don't do that, then the bees will actually use the fireweed pollen to feed and get the winter bees going. And then it means that in spring, I don't have any packed pollen for when they start brood rearing before I can do anything. Hope that makes sense. And then the hives are protected from the environment. You'll notice that in the picture, I use bubble foil. And most of my hives, I didn't have it there, is my entrances are protected, but I put a piece of plywood out front. This is, I think, in June, so we don't really have sunlight. We have 5-hour days and the sun is not very high. So there's no direct sunlight on the front of the hives at this time of year. But usually I put plywood, and that's to keep the bees inside the hive and keep the entrances from warming up. I want to decide when the bees cleanse, because if it warms up too much, the front of the hive might be 5 degrees, but the ambient temperatures tend to say minus 10 to minus 15, might be even minus 20. So all those bees are going to die. So hence the reason I don't want any honeydew in there is pure carbohydrates. And at the end of this presentation, I think I put a link to a paper from 1926 from the Canadian government. And way back then, they knew that white sugar, bees overwintered better in Canada on white sugar because it's just pure energy. So it means that you can eat it. They'll produce energy and water and CO2 out of it, but it won't fill their stomach up with ash content and material that they then have to poop. Okay, so for areas where you don't get many cleansing flights, and people say, again, the advice on Facebook and a lot of these forums say natural honey is the best. Depends where you live. I'd say clover honey is pretty good because it's fairly clean and it doesn't pack them up very well. So if the honey is a nice light color, then chances are it's a good overwintering honey. So I do have charts. I'm an engineer. I can't get away from it, but I'll try to explain the gist of it. So this was as of March 8th. And these are heating. It's basically analogous to heating degree days. This is a term that people that design buildings and heating systems, that's how they determine how big the heaters have to be, how much cooling, how much heating goes into a building. So you can see how I'm actually here, Fairbanks, Yellowknife, Dawson, Inuvik. There's a fellow up in Inuvik, the top line here, whose bees are still alive. Okay, so that's crazy, but it's awesome. Here, it's basically no cold temperatures. Okay, you can see how the green, dark green here, that's Edmonton. This is Whitehorse, this is Winnipeg, Winterpeg. The thing to remember is I'm gonna do this till the end of May. or sorry, the end of April. This week we've had minus 32 times, 3 times. And you'll see that the northern areas keep getting colder because our winter marathon's not done yet. But southern regions, the slope will flatten out. So that tells me the spring has hit your place. Okay. So when I get advice, say from Montana, so one of these yellow lines, one's Fredericton in New Brunswick, but one, I think this here is, forget which one is which. I'll change the colors there, but they're pretty close. You can see that their winter is much different than our winter. So my context is different than their context. So the amount of insulation I need versus what they need is different. I still recommend insulation or poly hives to pretty much everybody. There's a fella in North Carolina who lives by poly hives now. He's gone away from top entrances. He follows pretty much the same approach I do. And he has bigger brood nests. He has earlier splits. Before, it's like investing in the stock market. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. So before you completely change your approach to a new approach, try it for a season. Okay, so you can see that all our winters are completely different. This here, I took the idea from something I read in a book and I saw somewhere, but bees have to heat their brood nest or enclosure, or they have to cool it. And there's a desired temperature. Okay, so it's just an FYI slide. Critical temperatures. The brood nest is, let's say, 35 degrees, so 32 to 36, so 95 Fahrenheit. The temperature of the thorax of the bee is 27. Typical bees need a thorax temperature of 18 before they can fly. That's not necessarily ambient temperature. It just means their body needs to be at that temperature before they can fly. And basically at 6 degrees below, they freeze up and they can't move. So that's why if you see a bee fly in the snow and it stops moving, you put it on your hand, you start breathing on it, and then it either stings you or flies away. So that's what that is. So I'm not sure what the hobo data logger is. I just use the broodminder. Okay, just a question on the chat. And then the cluster is usually around the queen before they start brood rearing. It might be around 20 to 25 degrees around where the queen is. But as brood rearing starts, that area needs to be kept at 35 degrees C. If there's no brood, I've noticed, and the literature says 18 degrees C. As temperature outside of the hive goes colder or lower or warmer, that cluster expands and contracts depending on the temperature. So I'll cover this under insulation a bit more because, for example, my poly hives at -10, they're in a really light cluster, okay, a very loose cluster. But I know that in a wooden hive, they'd be in a super tight cluster. That has to do with that waste heat, keeping the temperature inside the hive fairly warm. Okay, metabolic rate. You don't need all this technical stuff to understand what it is, but what you need to understand is it's how much honey they consume based on the temperature. Okay, so over here, Dr. Seeley a while back and Dr. Southwick. So you'll notice here it says ambient temperature. So in my calculations now, I've taken this as my interior, the coldest interior temperature in my hive, okay? Because it's -40 outside, but the coldest spot in my hive is -8 Celsius. Okay, so I'm assuming my metabolic rate is equivalent to -10 here, or -8. Okay, so a lot of these studies, you'll see that, for example, this brown line, that's the fluctuating temperature, but up and down, up and down. Most experiments and researchers, they do a lot of flat line environmentally controlled experiments, or they do black box survival experiments. So they have, say, 40 hives set up one certain way, and then another 40 hives set up a different way. And then say spring comes, then they measure what the survival rate was for the different sets. Okay, so I call that black box because they didn't really measure what's going on inside, and they can't really say why one survived versus the other than the assumption they're making around the wrapping or whatever they did. So just to cover briefly, this red line here is the brood nest temperature. Okay, so you can see as spring or fall comes, the temperature drops, and then usually in October, rearing stop completely. Usually the queen slows her laying in August, mid-August, and basically by early October, there's none. It's flat till the solstice, and then it starts going up. So one thing I discovered now is this flat here is because of my position of my sensor. My sensor is actually more towards the back of the hive. So this has to do with where the cluster is with regards to my sensor. Okay, so, and then this slope going up is actually the brood or the cluster moving towards the center of the hive. So it's actually the brood or the cluster moving towards my sensors, hence it's warming up. And then the brood rearing starts, and then the first pollen and stuff happens. So just to show that this is stuff that I do in the background to try to come up with better ways of managing my bees. So types of heat transfer. A is conduction. So basically that's where it's through solid to solid. It's one side is cold, the other side is hot, and the heat just conducts through that solid. Okay, B is convection currents. It's where the hot air rises and then it sort of flows around in circles. And I say circles, there's some type of fluid motion. Okay, so just to answer some of those questions, I've got two hives. One hive, my double, has 8 sensors in it in different locations, and my single, one of my singles has 4. And then each other hive has 1 in the center position. Okay, so it just gives me an idea of what's going on in the hives. And it helps me predict and understand why it's not surviving or why it survived. So the cluster, there's like an envelope of bees with their butts sticking out, and those are the insulating bees, and then the queen's somewhere inside here. And then this cluster moves around. Okay, so another concept is thermal mass, and it's like a big slab of concrete warming in the sun. Once the temperature drops, that slab of concrete will release some of that heat. Okay, if you go with the bare minimum amount of honey you need, so early in the winter, you'll be fine because you've got thermal mass there. But as they get lower and lower in their honey stores, they lose the impact or the benefit of that thermal mass. So then what happens is, and then also with natural mortality during the winter, is your cluster is actually smaller in the spring than it is in the fall. So you got no thermal mass and a smaller cluster maintaining that same area. Hence the reason I say, don't be shy on how much honey you leave in there. And I skipped the radiation, and I'll explain why I don't want radiation, solar radiation on my hives in the winter, okay? Because just if the sun heats the interior of my hive, it means that my insulation is not doing its job, okay? So It's the same with a house. If your walls are super hot, it's harder to keep a house cool in summer in a poorly insulated house than a well-insulated house in summer. Okay, so it's the same concept. Okay, so I guess about blocking off your top entrance is, are you using a solid board or a screen bottom board? And you'll see that has an impact. So how does insulation work? So basically heat naturally flows from hot to cold. It's used to slow the heat transfer, and don't neglect the bottom of the hive. So actually don't put your hives on a concrete slab because it's actually pretty bad. Okay, so I'll just go through this fairly quick. So the red, the intensity of the red is the ambient temperature inside, not the ambient, but the internal temperature of the hive, generalized. If basically, and knowing that we lose more heat from the top and with the top entrance, if in just a wood hive, the bees, whatever heat they produce, that waste heat goes to the top, it will keep the upper half of the hive fairly warm. Hence the reason a lot of these clusters tend to spend a lot more time on top of the hive is because it's warmer there. But also your top cover here, if it's not insulated, it'll drip back moisture. And your side walls, the condensation points will be much higher on a wood hive. On an insulated hive with a top entrance, what you need to do is make sure you constrict or you have a managed lower entrance. So you don't want a massive open bottom entrance because that air is just going to flow right through and suck a lot of that heat out. So a lot of the people here, they have constricted smaller entrances on the bottom, or the bottom entrance actually gets plugged up during the winter with snow, and it just prevents a flow through ventilation. Okay, so on my setups and a few other people I know using the poly hives is this year, instead of just using the standard lid, I went R30 on top to R20 to 40, and my screen bottom board is always open. So in case my bottom entrance ever gets plugged, they can suck air through the screen bottom board. And yeah, when I open the hive up to check on top, the bees, basically they cover a nice little cluster up there. Makes sense? And like the one comment about the bees coming out and dying in the bottom and suffocating, I guess it depends over how much time. Is it instantaneously? It's because I do get mortality out front here, but when I do test the bees, most of them have either these little spore things or they have Nosema, or the wings are all beat up and it's just old bees. But with the screen bottom board open, I don't get that issue. So convection currents. So this is my supposition, it's my theory, because I don't have a top entrance, but in the summer, my landing board, especially during nectar flows, it's always soaking wet. And because my evening temps are so cold or my morning temps are so cold, so you got warm air coming out of the hive that's humid, hitting a cold surface, it condenses out. And I've never had issue with wet honey in my hives, even without top entrances. So this here, again, just shows the hoarfrost coming out of these hives in the winter. So it's probably a -30 morning or day, and it's just full of hoarfrost. So it's telling me that the warm air, the moist air is coming out the way it should be. And on a warmer day, say a -5, -10 day, I will see some bees walking around here, especially on my doubles. And if I look with the flashlight, I can see the bottom of the cluster just above the entrance here. Okay, so I know it's in the front and not in the back. So moisture and condensation. So moisture is water vapor in the air. Okay, so a lot of people will talk about moisture problems. Moisture is only a problem when it condenses out. So warmer air has more moisture in it. And the dew point is the temperature at which the moisture vapor condenses out. Okay, so I put a couple pictures, and the brighter the color, the more heat loss. Okay, so heat loss tells me that on the other side of this bright color, it's cold. Okay, on the next slide, I'll show you a picture proving that my theory is correct. And then you can see how my temperature sensors, I'm gonna cut these little plastic tabs off now and just tape the ends and hold them inside the hive and not have them stick out. And even this little insert board that I use to make a space so I can put a pollen patty is a heat sink. So all these points are points where I guess I lose heat and where condensation happens. So warm air rising from the cluster has the highest moisture content. So cold surfaces will cause this moisture to condense out into liquid. A lot of times, after a 1 week of -30 to -40, the bottom of my hive here is just caked full of ice. But luckily, a lot of it flows through my screen bottom board and away from my entrance, so it doesn't get plugged up. Infiltration points, so where things stick through your hive it's a wet spot, and you'll get mold. And when you do your first spring inspections, look for mold spots and wet dead bees. So on my my poly hives, you'll see there's a hole here. I use a little soldering gun to melt holes into some of my mediums to make a top entrance, but now they're all plugged up. So I've plugged them all up, but usually polystyrene hives do not have top entrances. Other than those license, but don't get me going on those license. I have 4 of them, and I've had to learn to use them properly. So anyways, controlling condensation. Holy, time flies. We've got one way is to reduce honey consumption. So the more honey they consume, the more water they'll produce, because 18% of honey is water. So a percentage of that will become water inside the hive for them to have to manage. So extra insulation actually reduces honey consumption. So tape this. So where on the outside, I use tuck tape, so that red moisture barrier tape to tape all my seams. And I'll actually consider putting like neck warmers, extra insulation on all my seams. So you can see how my seams here, there's some moisture and some mold, but this is last week. So you can see it's a really nice cluster. And you can see how this orange line here, these plastic things, are actually weak points in these hives. They're cold points. And you can see the same here, but you can see where this temperature sensor comes in, how much moisture and mold there is. This was actually fairly cold that day, and this cluster was in both boxes. So it seems small, but it's actually a 2-box, probably 6 frame. So it's about 12 frames of bees, this one. But you can see where the sensors come in, you get cold spots. So this chart here is a lot of folks overwinter their hives as singles. One hive where the cluster will probably tend to spend most of the winter in the middle because it's the I guess, warmest spot or at least cold spot because there's less cold contact spots. The challenge here is this cluster is a lot smaller. It'll be a lot tighter. Condensation can happen in any of the four corners or four walls. And if you get a really long period of cold, those bees will lose access to the honey stored in these outer edges, okay, because they're in cluster. They can't really move very much. Okay, so when you put two hives together, or three, the one in the middle has it really, really nice. You can see that the cold spot in the hive now becomes this far corner, because the cluster in my situation tends to spend most of its time at the front and then towards the shared wall. Okay, by doing this too is I reduce the amount of heat loss in that hive. Okay, because it's one less wall exposed to the environment. And you can see how, for example, this box here, along the edge here, this is just a 1x10 that I've trimmed to fit along the sidewall, because I was always getting a lot of dead bees along my sidewalls, and they were always soaking wet dead bees. Okay, so if I go back here, you can also see how the handles are a lot brighter than the sidewall here. So there's about an inch less insulation where the handles are. You can see the picture here. So that's a natural condensation point. So this year I've actually put some foam in here, and I've actually taped my handles on a few of the hives just to see what the difference is. Okay, because I don't want my top box to have this condensation point. Maybe in the bottom is okay, and towards the back, but not in the front or in the middle of the hive, because then that'll get my bees wet. So again, just a piece of plywood here, and that was just to remove that cold point and a place where my bees can die from cold. So my box it's a 10 frame box. I use 9 frames. And I guess this season here, I'll be trimming these down to a 1/2 inch versus the standard 3/4 inch. And just to give a bit more air gap here and space. I won't do this. This is just how dew point works and how to calculate it. And I won't do this. So this, okay, visually, in this slide here is how I use my interior temperatures, the outside temperatures, and measuring where the dew point crosses my coldest point in the hive. And then this would be where the water condenses out. So you can see for most of the winter, I don't really get any condensation. And then we hit a week of -40. And you can see at the latter end, as we start getting warmer, because the sidewall is cooler, is where my condensation happens. Okay. So again, I won't cover this one too much, but it's about thermal mass and how it works. So if you go into winter light, you won't have any thermal mass to help you through the winter. Okay, and then basically you can clearly see that in a polystyrene hive versus outside temperature, it's a lot flatter and above the clustering temperature than a non-insulated wood hive. I just wanted to show certain people and myself that in a wood hive, if you don't insulate properly, and it's not that cold, it's like -15 here, even -10, the inside of the hive is too cold for the bees to not be in cluster. Okay, so just illustrating the point. So entrance protectors and solar radiation and wind protection. You can see how I use plywood, and then I use snow to my advantage. This year, during the first brutal cold, a -40 week or so, we didn't have much snow, so the hives were fully exposed to -40 for about a week without much snow, and then we got lots of snow. And then for the second cold run, the hives were protected with some snow. And the other thing these pieces of plywood do is it creates an air gap at my entrance so that it never plugs up. And then over here, this was a couple weeks ago, but then we got another 4 inches of snow. But you can see I put sawdust and wood ash along the snow just to get it to melt faster and to darken, so that the bees that do cleanse out don't get blinded by the snow. And if they have to land, at least they can land on something that's not frozen. So these are my setups. So you can see I either do 2 doubles together or 3 triples, or sorry, three doubles together in the same, and I put my weak one in the middle. And then over here is I put 2 single hives with the mega top insulated with a 5-frame nook in the middle. And then I wrap that with bubble foil. Okay, so all these seams, this red is where I've taped my seams. And then I've taped this bubble foil wrap at the top, and it creates an air pocket. And it goes right to my piece of plywood, and it protects the lower bottom entrance, or so the screen bottom board, from wind or anything flowing through. And it keeps the mice out too. So double hive management. So again, it's just a sequence of how I get things ready. So when I start my winter feed, say in mid-August, I don't go put 10 liters or 2-3 gallons at a time. I'll actually start with 2 to 4 liters weekly. I'm gonna start trickle feeding the sugar syrup, and I can see how quickly they're taking it, if they're taking it. And then just probably early September, I might do a 10 to 15 liter per hive, 2 to 1, and that'll be my last syrup of the season. And then they get the rest of September to dry that out. And if we get a really cold September, then it's like, ouch. But usually a full double, my target weight is about like I said, 120 to 150 all in with the body weight too. So these are just examples of setups. This is that piece of plywood that I put on, no, piece of plywood, my cutout that I put on the side, and it helps take away that condensation point. And then I don't get all those soggy dead bees along my side here, which I was getting all the time. Okay. This is an example of Nosema, no Nosema. And this was from 2 years ago, and I've got the same picture this year for 2 hives this year. So 1 Nosema, no Nosema. And you can see how I've got this little roof here. It helps prevent the wind from blowing directly in, but it allows the hoarfrost from flowing out. So this is a fellow who does use a top entrance. His lower entrance is fairly small. He puts a piece of styrofoam on it, but basically this is his setup. He puts this shell above. He's got this insert he puts in there with a big burlap wood chip pillow. He puts another piece of styrofoam on top, and then he has an insulated cover. And knock on wood for him, I think he's 3 years now, not losing a hive. And he overwinters 4 to 5 hives usually. So he's got, and he always gets like crazy populous hives. He's my idol. So this is a similar setup. So using wood hives with 4-inch styrofoam, and he's got moisture quilts on top with candy here with styrofoam on top. And you can see how he put 4 hives together. It looks like a prairie wrap, but it's all white. We've mentioned this stuff here is just a relationship between wood and poly. So basically, out of cluster at -10, decently insulated hive. It could be a wood hive that's insulated. -10, it's not really in cluster. And the misconception here is that it will consume more honey, but it doesn't, because it's actually not brood rearing. And the bees actually don't need to keep warm, they're just roaming around. Won't go through all the charts, but basically, just so you know, I do my homework, and I've compared different setups. And like I said, the cluster size versus the volume is important. And you can see how a 5-frame nook, and then a single, and then a double. So it's really the number of bees per cubic meter or cubic feet. And you can see that in general, a bigger cluster will produce more waste heat versus a smaller one. And even the heat production per cubic meter is fairly similar. Okay, and then this is the insulation factor. So the reason why putting hives together, it's common sense, but it's the surface area exposed to the cold weather is smaller, so the A, hence the reason there's less exposure. So this is choosing the right box. So usually mid to early August, I'll make a decision, is will I overwinter this hive in a nook, in a single, or in a double, depending on how many bees there are. So last year I pulled away an old queen in July, and my single is actually where I pulled that queen from because I requeened that hive with a fresh queen. So I knew they couldn't make a double, so I just overwintered her in a single. And then I didn't want to kill that queen because she was still laying, but not really well. And I put her in a nook box, and she's still alive and still going well. And you can see how it's just, this is 25% of the volume of this, and it's just volume. And I want you to know that you have that choice, it's possible. But this person here, or this hive here, actually needs to be well protected. Okay, up here it won't survive if it's 2 nooks together. You need it between 2 big guys or 2 medium ones. Okay, I think we're almost done. For chart people, this blue line here is a wood hive versus a polystyrene hive, and you can see that the area between these lines is the energy that the blue one needs. I like the next slide better, but a lot of the literature says that once brood rearing starts, the consumption per month goes up, which is true. But I've done the math, and most of that is actually because of heating the brood nest. So in a polystyrene hive, it will go up slightly, but not by very much. Okay, so this one here again is because it's all about bringing the outside temperature to the temperature they're looking at. So a brood nest wants the temperature at 35. So these are all the degrees from ambient that they need to bring that nest. So they need to invest this much energy to bring the nest to this temperature. Okay, so you can see that from mid-May to pretty much September-ish, a polystyrene hive is not wasting much energy for the brood nest because the waste heat from the cluster is plenty, or from the bees. But a wood hive uses a lot of that extra, it needs a lot of extra energy to keep the nest warm in the Yukon. This is the line for the Yukon. So for me, with my poly hives, is especially in the boreal forest where honey, there's not that much nectar when I do get nectar flows. So this here translated more honey for me. Okay, so or the bees can go for lower nectar percentage flowers. Okay, so that's what that means. And there's a couple nice papers from Derek Mitchell on the whole insulating and thermal efficiency thing. So let's see, 5 minutes. We'll finish and then we can do a quick Q&A. So diagnosing your deadouts. So if they did die, it happens. It happened to me, it'll happen to me again. Luckily, or hopefully, knock on wood, it doesn't happen to me this season, but I might lose one to Nosema in about a month or 2. Basic causes that you see in the CAPA, so this is the Canadian apiculture, something provincial apiary, I can't forget what it stands for, but so in CAPA, you can see that a lot of the causes for failures, winter failures, they use weather, weak colonies in fall, Okay, sometimes they use mites, starvation. Starvation is the second cause, poor queens. You can see everything I talked about was about mitigating these, because if you don't know your queen is good going into winter, she's not going to make it. So using poor queen, so these are all basic causes. Okay, these are things, symptoms that you see, but all of these are not the root causes. The root causes is where you take ownership and you say, I must own these faults and I need to learn and make better techniques to prevent these from happening. Okay, weather happens, but all of Canada has weather issues. We have winter here. It is what it is. If you don't set, like a lot of the Ontario folks in Southern Ontario, Guelph, that area there, a lot of them actually don't use insulation. They'll just use the felt paper, the roof felting stuff. And I was like, well, I just, coming from Ontario, that's where I'm from, the winters are still decently cold. And results tell me that whatever they're doing is not working and they could do better. So it's either a lack of knowledge from the beekeeper, they just don't know. So folks taking this course, wanting to learn more, not consistent wintering approach. So poor winter prep. They didn't manage their pests or their Varroa. It's a poor setup, and overwintering a weak hive in a large volume. Okay, so if the cluster or the nest was really small going into winter, we all think that bees need to overwinter in a double or even a triple or like 4 mediums and stuff like that. They'll overwinter fine in a single, and they'll even winter fine in a nook if set up properly. So I've talked about nooks. So for people in their going into their second year, or their second or third year, consider doing your first split if you have enough bees. And one thing I've done now is I'm going to start requeening and making sure all my queens are at least 2 years old or less. And yeah, hug these hives together. It's important. And instead of pinching a queen that's still laying, pinching meaning killing her, consider investing into buying a couple of these nooks, poly nooks, and putting an okay queen in there, especially where queens are hard to come by. And for example, now with what's going on in the world, queens will be hard to get by this summer. So take good care of them. I think we're almost done. One thing I'm trialing on my singles is a slated rack, and I've insulated them. I've got a bunch of new ones that I just insulated yesterday. And what it does is it brings up the bees off the floor. So it'll give them a nice dead air space below the nest. And this is that 1926 paper or research that the Dominion Farming Ministry did. It's actually a really good read, and you'll see everything's relevant now. So I'll leave it at that. I think that was the last one. And it's 4 o'clock. I talked for the whole 4. But if you want to take, let's see, a few minutes to do questions, we can do that. And then we'll call it quits, or you can just send me an email whenever you like. And I see one there, for example, small cluster going into winter. So I'll just go and show you what a good cluster looks like. So for example, imagine this is fall. Yeah, this is fall. This would be small for a double hive. This would be good. This is perfect for a double hive. Okay. So if you pop say the top box and you lean it so you can look underneath, if you do that, you see bees in both boxes and they cover frames like this, then you're doing awesome. Okay, but if you pop the box and you don't see many bees in the bottom box, but you see quite a few on top, then I'd say it's probably a good size for a single. And like I said, this is something I've got 10 years of practice now. So it's something you need to practice and understand. And if you do this, like for my location, I need to make this decision in August, early August, okay? Because I know my queens, she slows down in August. And if I want enough winter bees, I need to make the decision because I know she will lay plenty of eggs in this type of box with a pollen patty. But in a box with too few bees, the nests won't be very big even in August. So it means that I won't have enough bees going into winter and I'll have a small cluster. In my setup, they'll probably survive the winter, but they'll come out in spring really small. And then I'll have to take, instead of going down to a single, I'll probably have to pop them in a nucleus hive. Just to condense her and bring her back. So I've done that a couple of times where you bring her down. I guess pollen patties. I'll do the pollen patties one first. Pollen patties, I just buy the global patties, the 55% pollen ones. And I never put a full patty on. They're like 1 pound patties. I'll either do a quarter or half at a time. And on the 9 frames, I go wintering 9 frames. It's more because one problem with the polys hives is this wall gets chilled and my condensation hits it and it condenses out. So any bee that's along this edge here dies. So then I get thousands of dead bees. I probably go in with 40,000, so it's not too bad, but I get bees that die that didn't have to die. So my side walls and in my bottom board, they'd be full of wet dead bees along the outer edges. So since I put this insert here, this piece of plywood, it adds 1 R, but also it absorbs some of the moisture and also prevents some condensation. And you can see the gap here is too small for the bees to get in. So technically, I'm not even at 9 frames. There's 9 frames, but it's really 8 frames because the outer edge here is not really accessible by the bees. They can go underneath, but they don't really go there very much, if that makes sense. So let's see, I will be using some syrup once the evening temps get a bit warmer. Right now, if I put it, it would just freeze and the bees wouldn't take it. So if I did do it, I might just do a smaller volume, like a baggy feeder, but then the baggy feeders don't work very well. So they sometimes leak all over the bees. So I don't want to risk it. So I just use a fondant. I just take sugar. I'm going to start blending my sugar. I'm going to add some essential oils, some vinegar, and then I mash it, make a paste. And then the reason I was asking about that api pasta, I think it's called, is the bees seem to take it when it's moisture. Because when I make the cakes and they get really hard, the bees can't really consume it unless there's moisture in the hive and condensation. So I'm going to make myself little trays where I can just put the soft paste in there with a piece of wax paper on top, flip it over on the bars, and at least the bees can go get moist feed and actually use it. And that's for now. So I won't do that in winter. In winter, it'll be hard sugar if I do it, but in spring or early spring or late winter, I can do that. For the essential oils, I use something called Hive Alive. So it's thyme, there's thyme oil in there, and I think not lemongrass there, but I think it's thyme oil. It's called Hive Alive. And then the other one is the Nosema, and it's a product, it's like a tree bark from Romania extract. There is some research that shows that it helps with Nosema, but I'm not sure if it does anything if I put it in my feed, but we'll see. And vinegar, there's a few recipes. Some of them, instead of using water, they use vinegar. I think Rudy Peters shared one on the, to Bernie. If you check that North of 60 Facebook, there's a recipe that he uses. He's in terrace, and I think the recipe seems to work well. And the logic with using an acid, so the vinegar is to invert the sugar, and there's that. And another thing I am trialing is I use ascorbic acid, so pure vitamin C, and I usually add that in my syrup, and it acidifies my syrup. So instead of being a pH of 7 or 8, when I use a quarter teaspoon per liter, and it brings my pH to 4.5. And there's research out there, if you read the papers, about how vitamin C or ascorbic acid helps with overwintering and basically overall bee health. I'd say I put some powder in the sugar and mixed it in my sugar cakes. Again, I'm seeing if what happens. So if you check your email, the presentation, the link, I sent you the link of the presentation. So it'll take you to my Google Drive and all the info's there. Anything else? So you're free to send me an email or post something on the Facebook there on North of 60. And yeah, so hopefully they do make it through the spring or winter. And if they didn't make it, hopefully you learned what you need to do to help you increase your successes next year. Well, have a great day.